In this video, I will go over how to arrange all the main divs and elements on your page using CSS, setting the widths, the heights, the placement, the spacing, the borders, pretty much doing the overall layout of all the main divs and content areas before we get down to finalizing the details and the content itself. So let's begin by looking at the sketch. As you can see, my header is already pretty much done and formatted, although there are a few details yet to be worked out in the top nav, but we'll get to those details later. What I want to do is block out all the remaining divs on my page. So my left navigation div is aligned all the way on the left. There's a little bit of space, then a border, and then a little space, and to the right is the content div. The content div itself is broken up into a featured area and a grid of 3 articles, and these articles are just excerpts with a link to read the whole article. And this is followed by the footer, which is all the way at the bottom of the page. So let's begin. The header has been laid out using absolute positioning. So the left nav, which kind of follows the header, is beginning all the way at the top of the page. That's why it's getting clipped. We first need to make sure that the left nav is fully visible, so we need to push it down. We need to set its width and align it all the way to the left so that the content can show up on the right side. This is my left nav div, and I can also select it by coming over to the code and clicking on div ID left nav, or going down to the element selectors and clicking div #left nav. Let's come over to the styles area. I click on my CSS file and I add a selector for it. And I can keep the selector really simple since there's only one left nav on the page. I will set the width of my left nav to 170 pixels because that's what I have in my sketch. So that resized my left nav, but I need to push it down so that it starts over here. And since the height of my header is 100 pixels, I can do that easily by giving my left nav a top margin of 100 pixels. So over in the margin area, I come over and set the top margin to 100 pixels. So this pushes the left nav down, but it doesn't look quite right. I wanted the top edge of my left nav to line up with this line, that is the bottom of my header. But I have a little extra space, it seems. In fact, that extra space is before the left nav. So let's go into the code and see what's going on. So here I have my left nav, and just before it I have an empty paragraph. Now when I was typing out my placeholder text for the site, I would type the text and hit enter. And every time you hit enter, Dreamweaver creates an extra empty paragraph. So to get rid of this extra space, I need to delete this empty paragraph. And now I come back to my design side, and there you go. The top of my left nav is aligned perfectly where I want it. Next, I want to take the content div and bring it up here so that it sits to the right of my left nav and takes up the rest of the space in my container. So once again, I go and select my content div. Since my overall width is 800 pixels and my left nav is 170, my content div should be 630 pixels wide. So this is my 630 pixel content div. But to get these two divs to show up side by side, there is one more thing I need to do. And that is use the float property in CSS to get both these divs to show up in the same row. And here's how. Since my left nav is going to be left aligned, I select my left nav, go over into the CSS styles, scroll down to float and click on float left. So you'll notice as soon as I floated it left, my content jumped up and tried to align against it. But once again, it's because my header is absolutely positioned, my content starts all the way from the top of the page here. So as before, I need to give it a top margin of 100 pixels. So I go down and select my content div, go to the CSS selector, and give it a top margin of 100 pixels. And just like I had with the left nav, I'm seeing a little extra space here. So I'm going to go back to the code, and yes, there is an empty paragraph just before content. I'll delete it, come back here, and now my content starts at the bottom of my header. But the problem is my content div starts all the way from the left. So to fix that, I'll select my content div, go back to the CSS, and say float left. And there you have it. My content div now lines up exactly against my left nav div. So here's my left nav stuck against the left side of my container with a top margin of 100 pixels. And here's my content sitting flush against the edge of my left nav with a top margin of 100 pixels. So this is what float does. In this case, float left causes all these divs to line up against the left edge of the containing div, and they keep stacking up against the left till we run out of space. The next div, which is the footer, is supposed to be after these two, but completely clear them and start all the way at the bottom, flush against the left side. And as you can see, that's not happening. So I need to go to my footer div, add a selector for it, and because I want the footer div to be completely free of these two divs and not be part of this floating arrangement, I ask it to clear instead of floating. So it clears itself from all these floating divs and starts a new line of content at the bottom. So I could say clear left, since I have my left nav with a float of left and my content with a float of left. But to be safe, I'm going to say clear both. And see that as soon as I do, it's almost like hitting enter to start a line of text on a new line. The clear property in CSS starts my div on a new line, so to speak. So using the float and clear properties, you can take care of a lot of arrangement or layout of your content blocks. So let's continue formatting our divs. I'm going to go back to the sketch just to show you that my content area is built up of a featured area and then 3 articles, again arranged in a row. So just like we arranged the left nav and the content in a row by using float left, we will arrange these 3 articles in a row by using float left. But first, the featured div. So I have a div with an ID featured. I'm going to add a selector for it. Now I could just tell it to take up 100% of the width of the container, or I could specify it in pixels. For now, I'm going to go with percents. And then I'll give it a height of 150 pixels because that's what my design says it should have. Before we go further though, I would like to take care of the spacing between these two divs. I don't want them stuck to each other. I actually want a bit of space between these two divs, and I might as well add my borders while I'm at it. So for my content area, I have a left border which is the same color as my header. So I can go and copy this color from Illustrator, come back here, select my content div, and give it a left border of 1 pixel in that color. So as you can see, I do have the border, but just adding that 1 pixel border pushed my content div to a new line. This happened because that 1 pixel of added width exceeded the width of these two floated divs that were taking up the same line. With floated divs, you need to be careful and make sure that the width of all these divs that are floating in the same row does not exceed the width of the containing div. So now, since I added 1 pixel of border to my div, I need to reduce my width by 1 pixel. And as soon as I change the width to 629 pixels, it comes back here. I'll go into live view just to look at my border, and there it is. But I still need some gap between the border and the content. So, sort of like this. So I'm going to add about 10 pixels of padding on the left side of my content div. Once again, that added width exceeded the width of the container, so my content div wrapped to the next line. I need to go and reduce its width by another 10 pixels. And there you go. That's looking much better. As you see in the CSS box model, the padding, the border, and the margin add to the width of the element. Width, height, any kind of dimensions of the element. So we need to be careful when we are adding these and account for those borders, the paddings, the margins in the overall width of the divs or the content areas that we are trying to style. Now let's move on to the article grid. My article grid will also take up 619 pixels. It'll have a bit of a margin or padding separating it from the featured area. And then inside are 3 little divs that have the exact same style. So when you have multiple divs on a page with the same style, what we can do is assign a CSS class to them. And a class is different from an ID because an ID is unique to a particular div. Like this is a header, this is the left nav, this is the content, this is the top nav, and so on. With class, I can assign the styles to the class, and then all the divs or elements on the page that share the same class will receive the same styles. So first, I'll style my article grid. An article grid is an ID because I have only one article grid on my page. I gave it a width of 619 pixels and a top margin of 10 pixels. Now for my article excerpt, which is a class, and I have 3 divs of the same class, right now they're stacked on top of each other, but I want them to show up in a row. So I select any of the divs that have the same class, select my CSS, and add a selector. And as before, I can simplify my selector. You'll notice whereas ID or divs with an ID had a hash in front of them to identify that particular name or ID, a class has a dot or a period in front of it. Now I have three divs occupying the 619 pixels. I could work out the math dividing 619 by 3 and accounting for the borders and the spaces. As an alternative, I'm going to set the width using percentages. So for now, since there are three divs, I will set the width to 33%. That reduces their width, but they still show up one below each other. And if you remember, the only way to get them to show up in the same line is to use float. So I scroll down to float and assign a float of left. That gets all the three article excerpts to show up in the same line. Next, we can assign the borders and the padding. My article excerpts have a 1 pixel border of the same color as the header. So in CSS, I go to border, right side, 1 pixel, solid, paste the color, put a hash in front of it, and there you go. And that leaves the spacing between the article excerpts. In this case, I can use either padding or margin, depending on what you're trying to do. Sometimes padding works better than margin, so you really have to practice or try it out, and you'll get a sense of what works better in what situation. So going back to layout, I set a left padding of 10 pixels. And while this works, it exceeds the width that I have available, so I need to go and reduce the width. So by trial and error, I found out that a width of 31.5% makes it work. And that's what it looks like in live view. And this leaves my footer. I can first go in and style this list to appear differently, more like the list we see here. And I can also set the border and the text alignment. So first, I select this bulleted list, add a selector, remove the bullets, and I'm going to show you a different way of styling this list to show up in a straight line. First, as before, I go and select the li tag. Doesn't matter which of the list items I select, since they will all have the same style. I go and add a selector for it, footer ul li. And instead of using display inline, this time I will use float. So by floating these list items, they show up in the same line. And let's see them in live view. In live view, they do show up in a perfect straight line, but then they're stuck together. So let us space them out. The advantage of using float, you can actually specify the width, margin, padding, etc. So I'm going to give them each a left and right margin. So I'll give them each a left and right margin of about 3 pixels. This spaces them out. What I can also do is add these vertical separators by giving each of these list items a right border. So after adding the right border, you see that the border appears, but it's kind of stuck to the text. So we need to add some padding to our list items. And since the border is on the right, I'll just add the padding on the right. And there you go. That looks like a much better menu. I will leave the typography for later, setting the fonts, the exact fonts and font sizes. But I do want to get rid of this last border since it doesn't make sense to have a separator at the end of the list. So for that, I have to go to my last list item, and either in the properties inspector or in the code, I can assign it a class that sets it apart from all the others. So I've given this last list item a class of rightmost. Now with my cursor on this one, I go back and add a selector for it. And this is what the selector says, #footer ul dot rightmost. Go over to border, right border, set the style to none. And there you have it. The right border disappears. Now all I need to do is in my footer set all the text to align in the center. So for that I go back to my footer div, go to text, text align, center. This centers my plain text but not my list, and that's because I took each list item and floated it to the left. So to get around this, I need to wrap a new div around this list and then take that div and center it within the footer. So I go and select my UL, make sure I have everything from the opening UL tag to the end of the UL tag selected, and I go up to Insert, Div, Wraparound Selection, and give it an ID of footer menu. I'll just turn off live view to see it better. So I have this div footer menu which contains the footer menu. I add a selector for it, and in order to center it, first I need to specify a width. And since I don't know the exact width of this menu when I'm done, because I still have not changed the font sizes, I'm just going to roughly give it a width in percents. So let's say about 70% of the whole footer, just for now, and then set the left and right margins to auto, and that centers my menu. So now my footer menu is centered, as is my text. I can add the gray border at the top of the footer and give it some space that separates it from the content. So I select my footer div, choose its selector, set a top border, and also a little bit of margin to give it space from the content. And that's it for now. I have used floats, clears, width, margin, padding, and borders to arrange all my main divs in my page. I've also broken down my content div into a few smaller divs to go a little bit deeper into the arrangement. And as you can see, using float, clear, margin, padding, and border is a very useful way to customize your CSS layout and get it to look the way you want to. It's a good idea to do this kind of layout before you get into details such as typography. It just keeps the big picture in mind and helps you make sure that all your content areas will fit together, line up the way you want to, before you go in and make smaller adjustments such as font colors, fonts, and typing in the final content.